Good morning, metalheads of the internet, and welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown. And today we are looking at Leaves of Yesteryear from Green Carnation. Green Carnation is the passion project of one Terje Vik Schei, a prominent member of the early Norwegian black metal scene, having performed with the likes of Satyricon, Carpathian Forest, and Emperor. But don't think for a moment that this means Green Carnation is going to give you a blast of true cult, icy Norwegian black metal in the vein of any of the bands we've just mentioned. Instead, Green Carnation is a lot more fluid, a lot more diverse, a lot more open-minded, having primarily been labeled as progressive metal through the years, but also having dabbled with doom metal, gothic metal, alternative metal. In their very early years, they played a very straightforward and primitive type of underground death metal, and on pretty much the opposite end of the spectrum, in their final prominent years in the mid-2000s, they were playing around with more traditional hard rock, soft rock, and acoustic pieces. On surface level, this stylistic progression isn't too dissimilar from that of Cynic or Opeth's, but keep in mind all of these changes were compacted in a much smaller time frame, with Green Carnation having put out all of their seminal records in between 2000 and 2006, with the band having somewhat unofficially disbanded in 2007, with no real word as to whether or not their final record, The Rise and Fall of Mankind, would ever actually see the light of day. A record that I'm all the more curious to finally hear about, which, to be honest, is partially why this record is somewhat disappointing to me. Because that album, at least as far as we know, based on what's been released to the public, was supposed to be the latest entry in what Green Carnation is dubbing the Chronicles of Doom trilogy. It was supposed to be bold, epic, dynamic, possibly the biggest project Green Carnation had ever assembled. And Leaves of Yesteryear feels kind of empty. It feels kind of dry. It feels kind of nonchalant, blasé. It's not a terrible record per se. I mean, you can feel some of the passion bleeding in thanks to some incredible performances, and the production value is fucking remarkable for an album of this size and scale. But the music, the written original material itself, lacks weight and originality. And notice how I said original material, folks, because to my surprise, and likely to the surprise of many Green Carnation fans, this original studio album only has about 24 minutes of original material on it, as the remaining 21 minutes of this 44-minute original record is composed of an older track that has been redone for this record and a Black Sabbath cover. As a result of that, the whole thing feels somewhat fluid and incohesive in nature, as if we have an EP of original material sandwiched with an EP of outtakes and covers that could have easily been tacked on to the deluxe edition of any of the band's other records, perhaps as a part of a reissue or a remaster. Will Green Carnation fans hate it? No, I doubt that, but I can definitely picture them being genuinely disappointed by this very blatant false advertising, and I doubt that this album would in turn do much to really bring in new listeners, particularly those who are more accustomed to modern prog metal and can point out many other bands doing many of the things Green Carnation is doing here much better. For instance, opening tracks Leaves of Yesteryears and Sentinels feel extremely reminiscent of Modern Amorphis, Sowen, even a little bit of Spock's Beard, particularly in the former track. Some Middle Eastern flourishes and influences definitely help, as do the incredible harmonies and choruses littered across both tracks, courtesy of Green Carnation's longtime singer Kjetil Nordhaus. But these elements aren't really enough to make these tracks feel less redundant for me. And even these elements are not particularly immediate. I only really found myself appreciating this on my second and third listen. As a result of this, the best track on this original studio album ironically happens to be Green Carnation's updated version of an older song of theirs, My Dark Reflections of Life and Death. A 15-minute shape-shifting prog metal monster complete with huge riffs, massive walls of extreme metal fury, melancholic tones, and very lavish sweeps of orchestration piano. For God's sakes, they even managed to throw in these really slick, sexy, gothic, hard rock guitar riffs near the end of the track, and they make it sound like the most epic fucking thing in the world. It's not uncommon for older bands to redo their older material. We've even seen bands like Exodus and Suicidal Tendencies redo entire albums of material. But this is one of the few cases where an older band revisits their older material and actually makes it better. I would go as far as to say that if this track were released on its own as an individual EP, it would be a magnum opus for the band. Unfortunately, the other piece of unoriginal material on here, their cover of Black Sabbath's Solitude, does not fare quite as well. A beautiful, lavish, meticulously crafted and detailed sound mix is wasted on a song that feels so hollow, so empty, so derivative of so much new age and neo-folk music out there. Maybe 10 years ago it would have worked fine on the Hobbit soundtrack or something like that, but it doesn't really do a whole lot for me here. I'm unfortunately going to give this a 2.5 out of 5. I wish I could be more optimistic towards this, given the great performances, given the great production, and given the absolutely fantastic My Dark Reflections track. But it doesn't matter how great the record is from a technical standpoint if at the end of the day you have a 44-minute album where only one of the 5 songs is really all that interesting and engaging. And there's still just so much inconsistency between these other 4 songs. Arrangements that don't quite flow the way Green Carnation intends them to, and moments that inherently just feel somewhat unintuitive, derivative, and repetitive. I don't know whether this original material was written for this or if this truly is leftover material from maybe one of Green Carnation's older records or perhaps the aforementioned unreleased record, Rise and Fall of Mankind. But they certainly do feel like that. In fact, a lot of this record kind of feels like the kind of stuff that you would find on a greatest hits compilation, one of those compilations where you get the band back into the studio, they record 2 or 3 original tracks, maybe they throw on some demos and outtakes to beef it up, and the whole album is ready by Christmas. I do recommend you still check this out, but more so just because I want you to support Green Carnation, because I want to hear more music from this extremely underrated band. But I want to hear a full original studio album, not a bunch of EPs and outtakes that somehow got sandwiched into a 44-minute LP. 2.5 out of 5, there are a lot of things to appreciate on this record, but unfortunately none of it comes together in a complete, satisfying package. Still by no means terrible, but hardly the magnum opus that Green Carnation is capable of crafting. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? Thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately, and you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.